The Apostle Paul admonished the Christians of his day to be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone. But in order to carry out that command, we need to have a clear sense of just what determines right and wrong. Welcome to the Bible Study Hour, a radio and internet broadcast with Dr. James Boice, preparing you to think and act biblically. In the moral relativism of our day, the lines between right and wrong have become seriously blurred. More than ever, our world needs a moral compass for the times in which we live, and that moral compass has its roots in only one place. Listen now as Dr. Boice shows us that, as believers, we're to be examples and lead the way because only we have the revelation of God to guide us.
One of the things that always fascinates me are surveys, polls of values and attitudes of Americans, and not long ago I came across the most extensive survey I've ever seen. And so extensive it was published in book form. You may have seen it. It's called The Day America Told the Truth. It was advertised as the most massive, in-depth survey of what Americans really believe that's ever been conducted. It involved extensive interviews with more than 2,000 people, all in a one-week period. They were asked to respond to 1,800 questions each, and then after that, there were follow-up interviews and surveys to develop some of the things that came to light. Well, a survey of that scope reveals an awful lot of things, as you can imagine. But one thing it revealed, maybe the chief thing, is that America no longer has a sense of right and wrong. Here's some of the things they wrote. A letdown in moral values is now considered the number one problem facing our country. Our political and business leaders have betrayed us. We lie all the time. Only 13% of us believe in all of the 10 Commandments. 40% of us believe in 5 of the 10 Commandments. There's absolutely no moral consensus in this country, as there was in the 1950s when all our institutions commanded more respect. Today, there's very little respect for the law, for any kind of law. The number one rationalization for lawless and immoral behavior is that everyone else is doing it. If everyone else is doing it, why shouldn't I, is what we say. If I didn't do it, I'd be a jerk. Well, that's a real issue, isn't it? Right and wrong. The distinction between right and wrong is what civilization is all about, not to mention right religious behavior, but that is exactly the problem today. We no longer believe in right and wrong. We no longer know the difference between right and wrong. We don't even have a basis for determining the difference between right and wrong, and yet that is the situation into which our text speaks clearly. Paul is giving some very practical comments here, very practical application of theology in the 12th chapter of Romans. And when he gets to verse 17, he says, be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everybody. To do that, you have to know what the right is. Now, that verse 17, has 2 parts, and if you look at it carefully, you can see the first part is do not repay anyone evil for evil, and then there's the part I just read. Now, the first part we've already looked at, though from the other side. It's the negative expression of the golden rule, and in our last study, we were looking at the positive expression of the golden rule. The positive side, as Paul has it here, is in the words, bless those who persecute you, bless and do not curse. So blessing is the positive, not returning evil is the negative. It's part of the same thing. We've already looked at that. It's the second part that really concerns us here, because that's the part in which Paul gets into the need for right conduct. Now, since that's the new point, and since it's the point that needs particular emphasis today, it's the part we really have to study. Let me begin by saying that if you're familiar with the King James Version, and many of us are, you'll know that the translation is quite different. King James at this point says, provide things honest in the sight of all men. Now, that sounds like something entirely different. What it sounds like to most of us is providing for your family. So there's food to eat and a place to live and paying the tuition for your children when they go to college, things like that. That's not what the King James translators meant, but the confusion comes from the fact that the key word in the verse, the word that's translated right in the New International Version, has a wide variety of meanings. I looked up what one of the dictionaries has to say, and it has meanings like this: good, right, proper, fitting, better, honorable, honest, fine, beautiful, or precious. Well, the older version, the King James, chose the word honest. The New International Version, a more modern one, has chosen the word right, but it's actually only one Greek word that they're translating. Now, you ask at that point, well, which of them is right and which is wrong, or are both of the translations wrong? It's not a question of that. It's just a case, so often you find it in translating, that the word you're trying to translate is bigger or more inclusive than any of the individual English words that you could use to put it into English. Now, we're helped with this particular word by recognizing that it's the key term to express the goal of knowledge and education as perceived by the Greek philosophers. Plato particularly used it. The word is kalos in the Greek, and it is usually translated the good, because that's what Plato said knowledge is all about. That's what education is all about. It's to discover the good. And those who know the good and can order their lives in accordance with it are the educated people. That's what education is. And those who can't discover the good, don't know how to find it, and can't order their lives in accordance with the good, those are the uneducated people. So Plato's concern, the concern of Greek philosophy, was to discover this. Now, the problem is when you put that into various areas of knowledge, you have to change it to indicate what you're talking about. For example, in the area of aesthetics, what is the good that you pursue? Well, in that case, the good becomes the beautiful, trying to discover what is beautiful, but it's the same thing. It's the same word. Or in philosophy, it's the truth that you're trying to discover. If we're thinking of morals, it's what's right. If we're thinking of character, it's what is honorable or honest. Now, when you begin to understand that, you understand why the translations differ, but why they're actually talking about the same thing. What is Paul saying? Well, he's saying that this is what we should aim at. This is what all people should aim at. He's recognizing that the Greeks perceive that as well. But he's saying, you see, if we're going to be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everybody, Christians are supposed to lead the way. We're supposed to do what is right in all things because we, above all people, because of the revelation of God, actually know what that right thing is. We are to be known as those who always pursue the very best in all areas. Now, let me give you the same thing in entirely different words. Leon Morris is one of the great commentators, and he expresses it this way. It doesn't sound at all like what I just said, but it's saying the same thing in different words. Paul is calling on the Christians at Rome to live out the implications of the gospel. Their lives are to be lived on such a high plane that even the heathen will recognize it. They will always be living in the sight of non-Christians, and the way they live should be such as to commend the Christian message. Now, that's what we want to think about. Where do we begin? Well, if we are going to pursue what's good, true, right, honest, beautiful, or whatever it may be in life, it's perfectly evident that there has to be such a thing as the good, the true, the right, the honest, or the beautiful to pursue. In other words, there have to be absolutes. Say, if there aren't any absolutes, and we're trying to pursue the good, the right, the beautiful, and so forth, it would mean that we're trying to pursue something that doesn't even exist. And spending your time pursuing something that doesn't exist is insanity. Now, of course, that's exactly what has happened to American society. We live in a very insane culture. We've abandoned any belief in absolutes, and therefore we wonder why things are as bad they are. We make fun of honesty, and then we are shocked when people are dishonest. We mock patriotism, and then we're astounded when people betray their country. You say our problem is relativism, and the result of it is what Time magazine described some years ago by the phrases a values vacuum and a morals morass. Now, you recall that's what Alan Bloom was talking about when he wrote that book, The Closing of the American Mind, a classic critique of the failures of American higher education in the 70s and 80s. Bloom is a Platonist of sorts. At least his goal is the same goal as the Greek philosophers. If you would ask him what the goal of education was, and he's an educator, he would say the goal of education is to pursue the good. Find what is good and noble and honest and true. That's what it's all about. But as he says so eloquently and forcefully in that book, that's exactly what higher education cannot do, at least not anymore. And the reason it can't do it anymore, it hasn't done it for several decades now, is that we live in a society in which the underlying philosophical basis is relativism. When you have relativism, you don't have absolutes. If you don't have absolutes, you can't pursue them. In order to pursue a goal, there has to be a goal. To have a strong moral society, we have to have moral absolutes. Otherwise, the only thing that you have, the only thing that takes the place of the pursuit of the good is pragmatism, or that which is expedient. In other words, education becomes finding what works or what's easiest under the circumstances. Now, that's the way our culture operates, and we see it in all areas of life, not the least of which is government. We don't have any heroes today, and we don't have any real moral leadership in government. Now, you don't have to think back very far in American history to come up with heroes. There was a time when people really believed in heroic actions and admired people who took them. Think of names like Charles Lindbergh, who flew the Atlantic, great hero in his time, or Babe Ruth in sports, or Henry Ford in manufacturing, or Douglas MacArthur in the military, or George Washington Carver for his inventions and so forth. You see, we don't have any of that today. The only heroes we have today are the television stars, and they aren't really heroes. All they are is celebrities. You know, it's the idea that everybody's going to be famous for 15 minutes, and as long as your name's well known, you become a hero or you function as one, but you're not a hero. A celebrity is exactly what you are. Here's the question: why aren't there any heroes today? Well, the book I referred to that contains this poll, The Day America Told the Truth, says this, and this isn't bad for a secular publication. It's very perceptive. There are no heroes because we have ceased to believe in anything strongly enough to be impressed by its attainment. If you don't think anything's worth attaining, then if somebody attains it, you don't think anything of them either because, well, why should you bother? That's the problem with heroes. Same thing is true of moral leadership in government. We don't trust our government. We don't trust people in government. We don't even believe that they're honest. This book contains a rather sad anecdote. Let me share it with you. In 1987, a university president was teaching an adult Sunday school class in his local church. So he's a Christian and a university president. And because of who he was, he had rather distinguished people in his class. He had bankers, business executives, college professors. He asked this question. It was based on a recent news event. You may think back on it. We hear in the news, he said, that an Iranian ship has been sunk in the Persian Gulf. The Iranian government says that it was sunk by American torpedoes. The U.S. government says that the ship hit Iranian mines. Whom do you believe? The class was silent. Nobody answered. Nobody said a word. Everybody wanted more information before deciding what they thought had happened. And we're not surprised at that. That would happen right here if we did exactly the same thing. But you see what it means. Not one person in the class trusted his own government enough to believe it would be telling him the truth. Now, that's the climate in which we live. We obviously need to have our national morality revived. But how? That's the one thing we can't get. You see, that's exactly what the problem is. We can't have it because all we think about is that values and everything else that once was considered noble or worth attaining is merely relative. Here's what Chuck Colson told the Harvard Business School some years ago. He had said in one of his writings that they couldn't teach ethics at the Harvard Business School, and because Harvard's a genuinely liberal education, they invited their critic up to talk to them. So Colson came and he gave an address on values. It was called The Problem of Ethics, and what he said is that they couldn't teach ethics because ethics requires absolutes, and the philosophical basis of American higher education, including education at Harvard, was relativistic. He said there's a big difference between ethics and morals, and then he explained what he meant. Now here's the way he put it. This is exactly right. The word ethics derives from the Greek word ethos, which literally means a stall or a hiding place. It's like a stall where you would put an animal to keep it. It's the one place you can go and find security. In the stall, in the ethos, there is rest and also something you can depend on. The ethos is unmovable. Morals, on the other hand, derives from the Greek word mores, and it means always changing. So ethics, or ethos, is the normative, what ought to be, and morals, or mores, is the relative, that is what is. He said, unfortunately, in American life today, we're totally guided by moral rather than ethical determinations. So we're not even looking at ethical standards. See, he was arguing that in order to have ethics, a nation must have access to a set of absolute values, or at least believe that those values can be found. What we say as Christians, you see, is that the only valid place they can be found is in the biblical revelation. Because if you're talking about absolutes, none of us are absolute. We don't have access to that. You have to get your absolutes from that one who alone is absolute, and that's God. So to find out what is absolutely right and what is absolutely wrong, you have to have a biblical revelation. That's why the Judeo-Christian value system operated so well in Western culture for so long. It was a valid basis, and it's also obvious that that's exactly what we need today. Now, a number of years ago, there was a movie with the title, Do the Right Thing. Good advice, even if it's impossible in a relativistic culture to know what the right thing is, but it's what we need, and it's what the Bible tells us to do. That's an expression of what Paul is saying in our text. Now, there are lots of ways you can look at that, but let me take you to some verses in the Bible that tell us what that means. They open up areas in which Christians have to do right. In the 8th chapter of 2 Corinthians, Paul is writing about the way he was handling a large sum of money that had been given to him by the Gentile churches for the poor Christians in Jerusalem. There had been a famine in that area of the world. Many of the Christians there were starving. The Gentile Christians were urged to express their common brotherhood with their saints in Judea, and so they gave this large sum of money. Now, Paul was entrusted with it. He was traveling to Jerusalem. He was to convey it to the saints. But in this 8th chapter, he explains how he was committing the money to a group of men appointed by the various churches so there would be accountability and nobody would be able to question or cast doubts upon what they did with the money. Now, he explains it in verse 21. He uses this very word that we found in Romans 12:17. Kalos, translated the right. And here's what he says. We want to avoid any criticism of the way we administer this liberal gift, for we are taking pains to do what is right, not only in the eyes of the Lord, but also in the eyes of men. Well, think about that for a moment and apply it. Think of all the scandals that have taken place in the church because of the way money has been handled. You see, if we're going to be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everybody, we have to begin here at least. We have to be absolutely above board in what we do with money. That is why at the Bible Study Hour we have the books audited every year by an independent outside agency. It's just a way of keeping above board in the handling of funds. Here's a second text. In Colossians, Paul is writing to those who own slaves, and he's speaking about fair treatment for those who work for us. Masters, he says, provide your slaves with what is right and fair, because you know that you also have a master in heaven. Now, the word that's translated right in that verse is not the same word that we've been studying. It's not kalos. It's actually the Greek word dikaios, and it's the word from which we get our word for righteousness. Greek word dikaiosune. Now, that's a different word, but it's very much the same idea, because dikaios means conforming to a standard, right, proper, fair, honest, innocent. You see, it's a different word, as I say, but it means roughly the same thing. I would say that dikaios is a close biblical equivalent of the secular philosophical Greek term kalos. Now, what does that mean to us? Well, it means treating those who work for you fairly. You're in a position to have some say in what's done. We're not to use other people as tools for what we can get out of them, or always trying to get the highest profit at the lowest possible cost at their expense. Not supposed to be the goal of Christians. It means that Christians should lead the way in what today we would call fair labor relations and work always for the good of their employees and the betterment of their lives. You say, do Christians do that? Yes, they do. One recent example is Wayne Alderson. He's a man who was a coal miner's son. He grew up in western Pennsylvania, and he pioneered constructive rather than antagonistic labor management relations. He came in on the management team of a foundry in a city known as Pitron. It was the Pitron foundry. They were on the verge of a very disruptive and potentially explosive strike, but he took time to hear what the concerns of the employees were. He listened to the union. He worked with them. He respected them. He treated them fairly. He made changes, and as a result, he soon turned the plant into one of the nation's most productive and profitable operations. Today, he heads an organization known as Value of the Person, which is trying to apply biblical principles to labor management relations nationwide. Here's the third area, respect for one's parents. One sad part of the loss of values in American society that's highlighted in that book, The Day the Americans Told the Truth, is a breakdown in what they call filial piety. That is, the concern of children for their parents. What they discovered is that more than half of all Americans admit they don't plan to take care of their parents in their old age. They don't feel responsible, and the parents, for their part, don't even expect to be taken care of. Bible standard is quite different. The fifth of the Ten Commandments says, honor your father and your mother. Paul in Ephesians 6:1 says, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. It's the word dikaios. Well, a list like this could go on indefinitely, because if we're going to try to do the right thing, everyone in all areas, it concerns everything we think, say, or do. But let me give you one last text, and I've held it to last because in a sense it sums up everything else that you could possibly say. It's the text I began with, Philippians 4:8. Finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. See, we live in a very trashy culture. Even worse than that, we live in a culture which is sinful, evil, ugly, and perverted. It's hard to stay clear of it. It's very easy to be sullied by it. And yet, it was no different in Paul's day. The Roman and Greek world in which Paul lived was a slime pit. And yet Paul writes to the Christians in exactly that culture, and he says, in spite of that, nevertheless, you are to do always what is right, pursue the right things in all circumstances. It's a way of saying, even if you talk in secular terms, we're to pursue the best of the world around us rather than the worst. Well, that brings us down to the bottom line. It's where the rubber meets the road, and I would say at this point we still have one problem. You see, the first problem is knowing what the right thing is so we can do it. And what I pointed out is that in a relativistic culture, you can't do that. There really is no way of knowing what is right. You need a biblical revelation. At least you have to believe in absolutes. That's the first problem. We have the absolutes. We have the Bible. That's not our problem. Our problem is quite different. It's having the will to do what is right even when we know what it is. I say that because in spite of everything I've said about America's moral decline and the loss of a fixed moral standard for most people, many nevertheless believe they should do right, and in some cases they even believe they know what the right is, they just don't do it, even if they want to, even if they're sure they can. Now, a moment ago I mentioned Chuck Colson, and that address he gave at the Harvard Business School in 1991 on ethics. In that address, he recognized both of these problems. First, knowing what the right is, and secondly, having the will to do it. And he illustrated the problems by his own experience. His experience is so rich, as you know, and he did this so well, and I want to share his own testimony with you and do it in his own words. Here's what Chuck Colson said. I grew up in America during the Great Depression and thought that the great goal of life was success, material gain, power, and influence. That's why I went into politics. I believed that I could gain power and influence how people lived. If I earned a law degree, and I did it at night, and accumulated academic honors and awards, it would enable me to find success, power, fulfillment, and meaning in life. I had great respect for the law. When I went through law school, I had a love for the law. I learned the history of jurisprudence and the philosophy underlying it. I studied Locke, the Enlightenment, and social contract theories as an undergraduate at Brown, and I had great respect for the political process. I also had a well above average IQ and some academic honors. I became very self-righteous. When I went to the White House, I gave up a law practice that was making almost $200,000 a year. And that was back in 1969, which wasn't bad in those days. It's kind of ordinary now, he says, for graduates of the Harvard Business School, but then it was a lot of money. The job I took in the White House only paid $40,000 a year. There was one thing about which I was absolutely certain, Colson writes. It was that no one could corrupt me, positively. And if anybody ever gave me a present at Christmas time, it went right to the driver of my limousine. I used to send in bottles of whiskey, boxes of candy, all sorts of things, right to the driver of my automobile. I wouldn't accept a thing. Patty and I were taken out on someone's boat one day, and I discovered it was a chartered boat and ended up paying for half of it because I didn't want to give the appearance of impropriety. Imagine me worried about things like that. I ended up going to prison. I never once in my life thought I was breaking the law. I would have been terrified to do it because I would jeopardize the law degree I had worked 4 years at night to earn. I had worked my way onto the law review and moot court, all the things that lawyers do, and I graduated in the top of my class. I wouldn't put that in jeopardy for anything in the world. I was so sure. But you see, there are two problems. Every human being has an infinite capacity for self-rationalization and self-delusion. You get caught up in a situation where you're absolutely convinced that the fate of the republic rests on the election of, in my case, Richard Nixon. There's an enormous amount of peer pressure, and you don't take time to stop and think, wait a minute, is this right by some absolute standard, or does this just seem right in the circumstances? Is it okay? And then second, and even more important, and this goes to the heart of the ethical dilemma in America today, even if I had known I was doing wrong, would I have had the will to do what is right? It isn't hindsight. I have to tell you the answer is no. I discovered that there was no restraint on the evil in me. In my self-righteousness, I was never more dangerous. I discovered what Solzhenitsyn wrote so brilliantly from prison, that the line between good and evil passes not between principalities and powers, but it oscillates within the human heart. Even the most rational approach to ethics is defenseless if there isn't the will to do what is right. And on my own, I can only speak for myself. I do not have that will. That which I want to do, I do not do. That which I do not want to do. And then he said this, it's only when I can turn to the one whom we celebrate at Easter, the one who is raised from the dead, that I can find the will to do what is right. It's only when that value and that sense of righteousness pervade a society that there can be a moral consensus. I would hope I might leave you as future leaders the thought that society of which we are a part and for which you should have a great sense of responsibility and stewardship, that society desperately needs those kind of values. And if I might say so, each one of us does as well. Is that practical? It's eminently practical. And it's exactly what Paul is talking about in Romans 12. The text says, be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everybody. Let's pray. Our Father, we thank you for this verse that we've been able to study. We see the problem around us, and we recognize how much we also ourselves, though we are Christians, are a part of that problem. Give us grace, not only to know the right, but to do it, and to do it through the power of Jesus Christ, who lives within us. For we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thanks for listening to this message from the Bible Study Hour, a listener-supported ministry of the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals. The Alliance is a coalition of believers that hold to the historic creeds and confessions of the Reformed faith, and who proclaim biblical doctrine in order to foster a Reformed awakening in today's church. To learn more about the Alliance, select the appropriate link at thebiblestuddyhour.org. Write to us at 600 Eden Road, Lancaster, Pennsylvania, 17601. Your financial support makes our broadcasting, publishing, online, and event ministries possible. Please consider making a gift at our websites, by phone at 1-800-488-1888, or by mail. Canadian listeners can reach us at P.O. Box 24097, RPO Josephine, North Bay, Ontario, P1B0C7. Thank you for your prayers and gifts, and for listening to the Bible Study Hour, preparing you to think and act biblically.